back to The Artistic Vision, a podcast on theology and the arts. This week we have a great guest, a long-awaited guest we're excited about, Jessica Hooten Wilson, who serves as the Fletcher Jones Chair of Great Books at Pepperdine. It's a terrible place, I'm sure, to teach.
I can't imagine having a look out at the ocean.
Yeah, terrible. But she's coming to talk mainly about Flannery O'Connor, as she just finished, or at least this year finished, an unfinished novel of Flannery's called Do the Heathens Rage. But she's a scholar who writes on the great books, on education, on the liberal arts, on reading. She's a literary professor is kind of her MO. But man, she was great. And I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. What were you excited about?
I was so impressed with her, first of all. But of course, going into this, Flannery O'Connor is just one of my favorites, and I think a great model for not just writers, but artists in general, and her sacramental vision and just so many layers. It's beautiful. And so I'm excited. Yeah, I think there's some really practical stuff, philosophical stuff, a lot of good in this interview.
Yeah, we are obviously deeply influenced by Flannery O'Connor and her literary theory and work as we talk about that for a sacramental imagination, which is kind of what we're all about. So enjoy this conversation with Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson. Welcome to The Artistic Vision, Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson. Thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation.
So we start this show with the same question every week. And the question is, what is your beginning with beauty? Some people were raised in homes where their parents were artistic, and so they had this inclination towards appreciation. How did you arrive at an appreciation for the arts and for beauty?
I was raised in one of those homes where, yes, beauty was at the forefront of what we were doing. One of the clearest examples that comes to mind, and there might be some people that scoff, and so I would just ask them to hold off the scoffing on this, because it was it made an impression on me when my dad had lost his job when I was little, and he was looking for new work, and he received this just amazing opportunity at Chevron to go to Kazakhstan, and it was just going to really be able to provide for our family in a way that we'd been struggling for a long time. And so in order to kind of remind us of God's faithfulness, he bought this huge painting that went in our living room. And the reason people would scoff would because it's Thomas Kincaid. And I know that there's just, a lot of kitsch and a lot of scoffing about, but for our family, just getting an awareness of beauty in the middle of suburbia, like here's the light coming into a dark place for us. And there was so much light in those pictures. And so, even though I think that my appreciation for beauty has changed, and I think that even my family would have changed. My dad's favorite painting now would be, he loves Rembrandt's Prodigal Son. So like even our understanding of light and dark has changed. But at the moment where we were, it was so beautiful to just see that over our couch every day. I mean, it took up most of the room, and it was just God's light is there. God's light is available, and we remember it through things like beautiful paintings.
That's great. In your kind of later appreciation, at least in your doctoral work, I think, was with Fyodor Dostoevsky and then Flannery O'Connor, which I don't know if I would put, Thomas Kincaid and these two authors maybe in the same realm. Why'd you want to spend time with those two voices?
Yeah, so I will say I did grow up with this kind of beauty that was more initially, maybe scrub things clean in order to see what is beautiful, focus on not Good Friday, but focus on Easter Sunday. And that was not the way that my own writing inclinations were as a teenager. I was really digging into the darkness and searching the darkness, and I probably felt more darkness, just the normal angst of being a teenager, right? The loneliness, the isolation, trying to figure out who you are and like, what does God want for you? I mean, all of those things. And so I was writing stories that were incredibly dark, which worried my dad. And I tell this story in my Flannery O'Connor book, Why Did the Heathen Rage? And my dad was nervous for my faith that I was going so dark. And And yet there was a mentor, a professor kind of stepped in and gave me The Life You Save May Be Your Own by Flannery O'Connor. And that was actually my turning point. I was 15 years old and I read this story that dug into the darkness, that wasn't afraid of the gritty, that wasn't afraid of the realities of Good Friday, but then also just kind of pointed towards Easter Sunday. And a lot of people miss the pointing in Flannery's work, but for me, that was very clear. It was evident that you could only actually show what hope was when you saw it in the contrast of despair. And I needed that vision. I had not yet had that vision of what hope and light could look like in artistic work until Flannery. And so then later I discovered Dostoevsky, and then I discovered, Walker Percy and some of these other writers who did the same, looking into the darkness in order to find the light.
Yeah, that's amazing. Hopefully we could hear some of that story woven into these questions, because it had to have been affirming to you, as someone who is drawn towards that, to see someone who was faithful in pursuing some of that. Well, how would you talk about her literary theory? That's like a big question. But what was she trying to do? Was she trying to do anything? And yeah, why was she? What was she going? What was she after?
Well, let's try a via negativa first. Let me tell you what she was not doing. Because I remember I had this one job interview one time, to be a professor, and the provost kept harping on, well, what's the moral of her stories? When you're in the classroom, but how do you teach the moral application? And I'm like, you're missing the point. Like Flannery says, 1 + 1 = 2, but that's not what a short story does. The short story leaves you in the mystery of the asymptotic truth that you get closer and closer and closer to and can't quite grasp exactly because of its mystery. And so for Flannery, she's not trying to give us Aesop's fables. There's nothing in her work that reduces the reality of the mysteries of God. She was very aware that the truth is above us, and we don't judge the truth by ourselves, which is nothing. This is all quoting from her. But we judge ourselves by the truth, right? That's the direction. And so when she was sitting underneath the truth as a writer, knowing how high it was, she had to write stories that grappled and wrestled with that reality. And so all of her stories are kind of that wrestling of Jacob with the angel or with God. It is, she's really being Israel in that sense, right? She's being one who wrestles with these mysteries. And so her aesthetics or her literary critique would be, if we're going to hold on to these things and realize that a God we would know would be less than ourselves, then the God that we strive to know must be higher than ourselves and thus mysterious and worth wrestling with. What does that look like in fiction? Well, in fiction, it looks like being humbled by the weirdness, being humbled by things you don't understand, being humbled by these moments in the story that make you question, that maybe cause like a scandal or a tripping up, in order to really get at something that is so much higher and bigger than you.
Yeah, when I finish a Flannery story, I have to just close the book, and I just find myself sitting there wondering what in the world I just read. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things art can accomplish, is to draw you into that sort of contemplation, to wonder, to not to be spoon-fed or these overt truths, but to be able to sit with it and to draw different conclusions, maybe even than she intended. When she writes about symbol, I think it was Good Country People, where she talks about the leg. When she's writing, she doesn't go into it saying, I want the leg to represent this, but I think she says it accumulates meaning as it goes. Something like that. Do you think that when she gets to the end of a story, I'm curious, do you think that she says, this is what that story means? Does she even know what that story means? Like, how does she approach fiction? Does she set out with something that she's trying to do, or does it just take on its own meaning at the end?
I think it's a both and. I think that meanings do accumulate over the course of a story. It's funny, I was asked to maybe give like a devotional at a church camp this weekend about the Eucharist, right? And as I was trying to think, and this is a Protestant tradition that's not familiar with sacramentality, and so I was trying to think, how do I impress upon them the necessity of saying the words of the liturgy, which they don't say in this tradition, and saying things each Sunday sounds very ritualistic to this community. I promise this connects to Flannery. And so what I was trying to do is explain to people that God creates the whole world with words. And then every time we say those words, we're re-embodying those things. And then as we re-embody them and remember them again and again and again, that meaning that accumulates in our own lives, in our own realities, in the ways that we're made up, right? That's what we're participating in the life of the church. So Flannery's doing that in her fiction, that she can take something like the leg. And at first it's just funny. It's a wooden leg. She's got crutches. She probably said something offhanded. I'm making this up, but I feel like I've got a wooden leg, the way she's walking around on crutches. And then well, what if a character had a wooden leg? What would that character be like? What if that character was dealing with some of the stuff I'm dealing with? But then over the course of the story, the meaning grows greater and greater and greater until Flannery understands almost the embodied meaning of that leg. It takes on a sacramental character. It is the woman's idol. It is the thing that she has placed her faith in. It is like God versus mammon. It's her mammon, right? And that has to be removed from her so that she can be laying before God. Again, the significance of that when you think about wrestling with Jacob, right? She has to be laying before God. She has to give up her idol. She has to give up this thing that has accumulated this much meaning, not only for the readers in the story, but for the character in the story. And so I think Flannery discovers that process, but she's informed by a tradition that words matter, liturgy matters, sacrament matters. And it's only when you have that kind of deep, invested understanding of the enchanted world and the world that God has created and why it is that way, that she's able to write that way. And then we're able to perceive it that way as readers.
Yeah. So good.
It's so kind of central to our approach and how we're wanting to talk about and think about art is a sacramental vision, and in creating out of that vision. And I think Flannery O'Connor is like the par excellence of doing that. Another
You're
question,
right.
kind of in her literary vision, I'm maybe thinking about the person who's read a Flannery O'Connor and thought, that's just a little too grotesque or dark or whatever for me.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think the grotesque is necessary, or in her vision, or maybe even in your vision? What does the grotesque add to maybe a sacramental vision? You talked about seeing hope in the despair, but does it have to be that grotesque maybe?
Yeah, so it would not be that grotesque in a prelapsarian world. So if we take things seriously, Julian Norwich says sin is necessary, inevitable, right? The reality of the world that we live in is a sinful and violent world. So when you even read the scripture, and I kind of have this difficulty sometimes with the Christians in my classes where they'll come into my classroom and they want to just read the Bible. They don't want to read these other things that are so violent and disturbing and problematic. And I always have to point them back to the scripture. I'm like, it's not full of Marvel heroes. I mean, that's not the Bible, right? The Bible is actually women getting chopped up and their bits sent to different tribes in Israel. The Bible is full of, is there a patriarch who doesn't sleep with multiple women, right? There is always this wrath of God that's being displayed. There's the violence of his people. There's the mistakes of his people, all the way up to the crucifixion, right? This is just the reality of the world that we live in. So even in that post world, Paul gets stoned. This is the world that Christians are living in is still that same reality. And to pretend otherwise is what Flannery O'Connor is afraid of. She said that people want to think that Christianity is an electric blanket when of course it's the cross. And so it's not that Flannery's inventing violence or inventing the necessity of the grotesque. She's acknowledging that it's there. But what people find uncomfortable is that she's acknowledging it can be redeemed. Mm-hmm. That you can actually take this violence that you are given in this sinful reality, and there can be hope. And people can't stand that. No one is uncomfortable with Truman Capote's horror because they're like, yes, horror. Nihilism, awful, despair, meaningless. I get that. Inferno. I have an infernal reality in my heart. All these things people understand, they relate to. But you take that and say, but the Lord can turn it into a good and instrumentally use something that's so dark. And they're like, well, That's the wrong horror that people, often have hold on and in Flannery's work. So for her, it is not inevitable that it be grotesque, but it is just the reality that we're in. What is beautiful in her work is that she doesn't stay there.
Mm-hmm.
So good.
Right. Do you have a favorite story?
I do. I love Greenleaf. I love absolutely every word of Greenleaf.
Nice.
Yep. It's my favorite. It's my go-to. Yeah, go ahead.
No, what is it about it that you love so much? I mean, everything you said.
Yeah. It is. It's one of those stories that if you ever get to hear me teach Greenleaf, and I do have like YouTube videos where I do this, and I can't remember. It's not like I watch my own YouTube. I don't know exactly what it says on there, but when I usually teach that story, I literally go word by word. Mrs. May's bedroom window. I mean, I go Mrs. and we talk about it. May's, talk about it. Bedroom, talk about it. Window, talk. We go word for word through the first paragraph because that story is so well done in the way that it brings the literal and spiritual meaning of the text together. It's brilliant. So that's one of the things I love about it. When you talk about Flannery's ability to access that sacramental reality or that other plane of reality, the spiritual meaning, it's all there in that story. So rich and so well done. I also love Mrs. Greenleaf. There's not a lot of saints in Flannery's work. Most of her work is about kind of these almost biblical heroes that fail and God is good through their failings, right? Instead, you have Mrs. Greenleaf, and she's actually just like a Saint Teresa, right? She's just in ecstasy crying out to God, pierce me through the heart. I mean, she just is a lovely example of this, what this holy foolishness might actually look like if we were in the South in the 20th century, right? And I love getting to show that to my students, that maybe we should consider that our lives are too safe and too domesticated, and our faith isn't as wild and crazy as it needs to be. So I love that. The last part that I would say is Flannery is in the great tradition. So one of the reasons that I validate teaching her in my sequence that usually begins with Homer and Plato and it goes all the way up to her is because she really is. And Thomas Merton said this when Flannery died. He said, you can't talk about Flannery O'Connor in the same vein as Cormac McCarthy or Carson McCullers. You need to talk about her in the same vein as Sophocles. That's who she is. And in that story, you really see it, because to understand that story without Ovid's Metamorphoses won't make as much sense to you, because she's combining not only our Hebrew and our, Palestinian God in the suitor of Jesus Christ, the incarnate God, but she's also drawing on the mythic imagery from Ovid, in which Zeus comes down from heaven and becomes a bull in order to woo his creation, which is Europa in the text. So all those layers are in that story as well. So I just think it's one of the best stories she ever wrote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so rich.
She talked about that story revealing the spiritual in the material or in the literal. She has her book of essays, right? It's called Mystery and Manners. What is that? What is Mystery and Manners?
Yeah, it's such a great title, because it really, it could have been easily called Spiritual and Literal, right? I'm just giving it all away. But that is what it's talking about. So the mystery is what makes people mostly uncomfortable. It's the eternal, it's the invisible, right? It's the hidden God. It's all of the things that you can't see explicitly that she's bringing to the surface, but she's bringing to the surface through the manners, through the literal, like through the particularity. It's one of the things that I think she has such a strong commonality with, actually, with Greek writers or Dostoevsky or anybody who is writing these kind of permanent texts that we would want to pass down, because they aren't saying that this empirical world is all there is. And if you remember the time that Flannery is writing in the mid 20th century, that was just kind of the common reality. Like, your life was only about the here and now. America was on the incline. Capitalism was rising. Coca-Cola was brand new. I mean, this is, that's the world she's writing in. And so you can have all of the things you want in this life that are just literal, empirical, visible. And she looks at those manners. She examines that life and what that would look like for a good life. And then she digs down underneath it to find the mystery of human existence. What are we not talking about when we say that's the good life? And she's bringing it to the surface. And when she brings it to the surface, it's still particularized. That's what I meant by Mrs. Greenleaf being this like saint, eternal significance, but in her own time and place, she's a farmhand's wife and like lays on the ground there in the middle of Georgia covered in red dirt. I mean, everything is very particularized as well. So when Flannery writes on that, she's just kind of always giving away this way of reading a text that most people don't know. And she is well versed in this. One of the other things that students push back a lot on, or even maybe readers, did the author like do this on purpose? It's kind of like what you were asking a second ago, Gary. Like, did she do this on purpose? Did she mean these things? And she explains in Mystery Manners that yes, she does, because she had never lost this way of reading the Bible that informed how she wrote her own work. And most people today do not read this way, and nor do they write this way. And so that would become like a manual or a guide for how to both read and write this way.
I'm really interested in a movement in Anglican history called the Oxford Movement, a Victorian movement, and they were observing rationalism coming over from Germany and fending off against it, saying the way that it's created this sort of disenchanted world. But what they said was we need to revive the church by recovering the allegorical reading of Scripture, because when you learn to read the Bible like that, you start to read all of life like that. And it's just a sacramental vision, enchanted. And that's what I love about Flannery is it's like the literal is a necessary vessel. It actually reading it spiritually gives it more meaning. It doesn't take its meaning away, but as a vessel of the spiritual meaning, it actually gives it more. And you could see her sacramental vision just naturally coming out in the way that she writes. And I think she's the model for artists in general in that sense.
Yeah. And you can't sacrifice either one. I mean, one of the things that she kind of joked with people reading her work wrongly would to try to analyze things as though they had another meaning when they didn't. And so she's always kind of cautioning us too about this tension, right? You don't want to give meaning where it's not there. And this is one of the reasons allegorical readings get kind of thrown out in the 16th century, is because I think that they had pressed themselves into a place where they were taking symbols in the Bible that weren't necessarily there, right? Like they were pressing too far. So the misfits hat is the example that she gives in an essay. She had English teachers ask, like, why does he wear a hat? And she's like, to cover his head. I mean, that's it. He's covering his head, or why is it black? And she's like, I don't know. That apparently was what was available. And so sometimes I think we just have to walk that line. I think Augustine talks about, you want to read things allegorically when you can't explain them literally, right? That's always kind of your indication to go allegorically or go spiritually. And he also says that any interpretation that increases the love of neighbor, right, would be a correct interpretation, love of God and love of neighbor. And I think that was true for faithful Christian writers, right? If you read Dante and you walk away thinking like Dante hates people, he loves putting them in hell, you're not reading Dante right. It's your first indication that you missed Dante. And I think you can say that about Flannery and Dostoevsky and some of these other writers.
So, I mean, one of the kind of our project in the artistic vision is to help artists cultivate a sacramental vision of the world that which their art flows out of. And so we kind of have Flannery leading us that way, giving us a model. How would you kind of encourage artists? How do we develop this sort of imagination that we can create beautiful, deep mystery and manner stories or art or whatever?
Yeah, I think, the virtues of the artist, I don't know how much this is talked about anymore, right? The idea of the virtue of the artist. But the reality of humbly submitting, the reality of being humble before not only what you're going to produce, but maybe also whatever art you're receiving. This is something that I find in C.S. Lewis as well as in O'Connor. C.S. Lewis, right, says that the first work is to get yourself out of the way and to receive what's there and not try to use what's there and to enjoy what's there. And Flannery does likewise. She wants artists to sit before that mystery and receive it. Or Diary of a Country Priest, one of my favorite examples is where he says, "Oh, miracle of empty hands." And at another moment calls himself the fire poker in someone's hands, right? Like, I'm just God's fire poker. I'm just his instrument. or Flannery calls herself God's typewriter, right? So there's just, I guess I could just go on with metaphors, but it is this idea that you completely empty yourself. And if you don't do that, what you end up doing is your artwork is didactic, it's preachy, you kind of control the meaning because you have certain things that you know to be true, and you're scared to say something that you're like, maybe that's not true. And you're afraid to discover a truth that is higher than you, because that does sound scary, right? You don't want to be heretical as a Christian. And so if you write something that maybe you're afraid is, wait, did I say something that's correct? Not correct? Why did my character just do that? My character can't do that. That would not be the right thing for my character to do based on how I know what is right. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so in the writing process, you almost censor yourself because you're maybe thinking about how your pastor would take what is about to happen in your story, or you're thinking about how your mom would read what is about to happen in your work. And it puts all of these brakes on you that it really is about you. And what you're actually doing is not protecting the people that you love. You're actually being really proud in assuming that you can assert the right meaning for the story, rather than artistry is a gift. You've received it. To be faithful to it means you have to let go in all sorts of different ways in order to really write something that actually is true.
That's great. That's great. So maybe on that line, in your own creative development, your most recent work is finishing an unfinished novel by Flannery called Do the Heathens Rage, which sounds like a terrifying thing. It'd be like finishing a sermon or something for me of one of my heroes, or finishing a painting of one of your heroes. It sounds like, why would you even try? But what made you want to do that, and what was that process like?
Yeah, it is incredibly presumptuous. It became more presumptuous as I started working on it. But when I first, went this direction, it was because the estate, there were people involved in the estate that had reached out. So Billy Sessions at the time, this is back in 2015, had said, we just need to get this out there, and we need to publish it. And at first I just took that on as like, yeah, let's publish this archival material as archival material and just make sure people can see it, kind of like republishing her letters, right? Nothing more audacious than that. But then as I got into the project, more and more the estate was like, you need to finish it. It needs to be a story. We're not going to publish this unless it's a story. And so then I got to practice like ghost writing, which was fun, but I also didn't want to be someone who is puppeting Flannery, right? Like I didn't want to feel like I was putting my hand into her characters and making them say and walk and talk. And so that felt a little too presumptuous as I started trying to do that. And then at the end, what I finally decided with is like, okay, how can I be faithful to what she's left in a way that tells a story the way she would want to tell a story? That's ultimately always her goal. And the story has to point towards the cross, the truth of who Jesus is, right? That's for her, the goal of pointing. Well, I can only do that by telling the story of the creation of the work and being as faithful to the pieces she left behind as I can. And so that's ultimately how that came together. It becomes very literary experimentation, but I think it protected the realities of both her and I, myself as a literary critic and as a writer, but also protected what she had given us and left us. So I tried to steward the gift that I was given there with her material, but also I'm hoping it points people to Christ. It points artists how to follow her lead and how to kind of pick up where she left off. And also there's a lot of reconciliation effort, I think, in that book, trying to say that the world that Flannery was in was a racially segregated world. And this was her attempt moving that direction as she began to believe cognitively more and more in integration. And we're in a place and culture now where we can bring this forward, and maybe it can act as kind of a salve and a way of bringing things together. So I had, I guess, a lot of hopes for the book.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that I was concerned about. Yeah, how is it going to read? Is it going to be like a clear shift? This is Jessica's voice, but your understanding of the way that she's a symbol. I think the thing I'm most concerned about in these situations is can they write like a true Southerner? Are they a Southern? You did a great job. You have Southern roots though, right?
Oh yeah. My family is my parents both met in Warner Robins, Georgia, which is like 45 minutes away from Milledgeville. So I grew up like several generations of Southern Georgia on that side. So Yeah, it's almost impossible for me to actually read Flannery O'Connor out loud without my accent coming out.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing worse than like watching a movie with someone who's not from the South trying to speak with a Southern accent, right? You,
Especially
you're,
when they can't tell the difference between like North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Texas. Like every accent is so different.
yeah, you did a great job. I really, really appreciated the way you talked about race with her, because I mean, it's at best obscure, like people talking about where she stands on racial issues. Really appreciated that. What about your collaboration with Steve Prince? How did that come
Yeah.
about?
He is just a better person than me. You know, when you meet people that are very saint-like and you're like, how often can I hang out with you? So he is one of those people that is just really just loves the Lord. And so I was grateful. He and I met at Duke at the Theology and the Arts 10th anniversary event. He was presenting there. This was 20, I don't know, 18, maybe 17, 18, I don't know, somewhere in there. And I was already in the middle of this project. And I was inspired to reach out to him actually when I was looking at Benny Andrews' illustration of Flannery's Everything Rises Must Converge. So before that, I had not really considered on getting it illustrated. But when I saw what Benny Andrews did, where he was able to kind of bring things to light in her story, it reminded me so much of what medieval illuminators did when they almost glossed the text. You know, they glossed the scripture and like kind of brought to light things that were lying underneath the surface. And Benny's illustrations did that for Flannery's story, right? It kind of completed the picture. It showed how African Americans can see things in Flannery's work that white readers may have blinders on, may not have had access to or thought through. And I trusted Steve as a brother, as a Christian, to be able to also draw on his experience as a Black man in America to see the things in Flannery that I might have been missing and to bring them forward in the art in a way that would be beneficial for people and fruitful for people, to be able to see this work and what it can bring to the table. So he and I really thought at one point, I can't even put this book out if we don't have this collaboration, because I think so much of what has been left behind needs to showcase how to move forward. And in order to move forward, you have to be able to say things explicitly. You have to be able to talk about race explicitly with charity. And you have to be able to love people, right? And show that love for people. And Steve did that towards me by saying yes to this in the book. And so I hope people can kind of see that in his illustrations really do bring things to the forefront that I was like, I never saw that. Can I tell you one of them? I don't know. I feel like
Yeah,
he should
please.
talk. I hate to like be his mouthpiece, but I've heard him speak on these illustrations so many times that I'll at least say a couple things to look for. There's a baptismal scene in Flannery's Left Behind Fragments. And what he did there, if you look at the illustration, you see the faces on the waves almost make faces. And what he was imagining was Emmett Till's body being drug up from the water, the faces that are underneath, all the ancestors of the Africans that were lost under the water as they moved to this country. And so this baptism was more of a baptism by fire than how I had read it. If he thought about being baptized in those Georgia waters, right? Like in those Southern waters, and kind of the move out of that, right? Like it's so beautiful to think of it that way, right? To really be like buried and die without parts of ourselves and brought into new light. It became a much more powerful scene, seeing it in correlation with his art.
Yeah,
So beautiful.
she's
Yeah. I mean, I
amazing.
think even taking on like that, even those scenes can be redeemed. And like that's the
Mm-hmm.
picture, the symbol of baptism. And that's what I love about Steve's work is it's filled with symbols that
Mm-hmm.
are meaningful and take on meaning. Yeah, it's so good. All right, last question. We end every time with just you having the last word. We want to encourage artists or challenge artists, and so what's something that you want to leave with artists? What's something you want to kind of communicate to Christians who call themselves artists?
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm sure that you sent me that question, but I'm still, um, my life is such with 4 kids and traveling every weekend that I did not
Mm.
read the questions before we got here. So this is going to just come from the heart and is
That's
not
great.
a
That's
deeply
what we want.
Go
pre-planned
for it.
thing. Yeah. But I have a lot of student artists that are in my class. And I think that the desire to make something that is going to become their vocation and become their life oftentimes puts up more blinders than it should when it comes to making their art, because they either feel like they cannot be influenced by other artists because they have to be original and they have to say something unique, and they're going to have imposter syndrome if they're trying to imitate the things that have come before them. And they also have to speak into this time and place and what will sell and what, so there's all these different eyes that are upon them. And one of the best things that I recently read was from, and I'm going to say it incorrectly, the Chuang Ta, which is an ancient Taoist parable. I'm trying to learn Asian great texts because I only mostly teach Western tradition. And so I'm learning these Asian texts. And one of the things that there's an artist in the text, and the artist has to make a wooden bell. And if he doesn't do it correctly, basically he'll be executed. So like the stakes are rather high. So think about like the pressure to make something and how much that's there compared to even like artists that you guys are talking to and speaking to. This is high pressure. And so what he does in order to make this bell is he fasts for 3 days. He relinquishes, he lets go. And after 3 days, he forgets those consequences. And then after 5 days of fasting, he forgets the fear of what people think. He forgets the fame and the rewards and the things that would come to him if he did this well. And then after 7 days of fasting, he forgets himself. And it is only at that point when he relinquishes himself that he walks out into the wood and he touches trees, and whichever one says, I want to be a bell, he carves into the bell. And so he makes it so well that people are like, this looks like it's made by a god or a spirit, right? But I think there's a lot of Christian ways of reading that parable. We have to be able to relinquish and to let go in order to really receive the art we're supposed to make. And it can't just be about fame and reward, and it can't just be about the money we need to make from it, and it can't be the expectations of those around us. Like, we have to let go and die to self when it comes to being able to make something that the Lord wants us to make, right? And I think that kind of relinquishing is probably the best way forward for artists.
That's beautiful.
Good.
I'm sure you would have crafted a perfect response, but I think that one was pretty good too. All right.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was good.
Well, thanks so much for your time and all your wisdom. Yeah, there's more to talk about. There's more to read from you. I'll put some show notes of all the work that you do.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, blessings on y'all, blessing on your listeners, and look forward to seeing you in person soon.
That's right. That's right. See ya.